October 17, 1958, 11:43 p.m. Beverly Hills, a quiet stretch of hillside road where the city's glow thins out and the houses stop competing for attention. Inside a Spanish-style home set back from the street, the lights are low, not moody, deliberate. The air smells faintly of tobacco and something older, leather, paper, wood that has absorbed decades of conversation. A man stands near the window, jacket still on, tie loosened but not removed. He hasn't sat down. On the coffee table, a single highball, untouched long enough for the ice to begin surrendering. Beside it, a phone. It has already rung twice tonight. It will ring again. He knows who it is. He knows what they want. And he knows exactly what will happen if he answers. Down in town, less than 20 minutes away, a dinner is unfolding without him. Crystal glasses, linen, a table arranged with the careful geometry of power, studio heads on one side, producers on the other, agents positioned like translators between languages that pretend not to need translation. There is a place setting that hasn't been cleared, a chair that remains empty long enough to be noticed, then long enough to feel awkward. Someone checks their watch. Someone else says his name lightly, as if it's still early. But by 11:43 p.m., everyone in that room understands something is wrong. Because this man does not miss dinners. Not like this. For 15 years, his career has moved like clockwork, one picture into the next, scripts arriving before the ink on the previous contract is dry, studio cars waiting whether he asked for them or not. He has been reliable in the way Hollywood values most, predictable, productive, always available. Until tonight. At 11:47 p.m., the phone rings again. He doesn't move. You can almost feel the pressure in the room with him, not panic, not fear, but something tighter. The kind of pressure that comes from knowing that one small action will preserve the system exactly as it is, and one small refusal might crack it. This is not a scandal moment. No shouting. No slammed doors. No righteous speech rehearsed in the mirror. Just a man deciding whether to participate. Hollywood in the 1950s does not reward hesitation. It rewards momentum. Stars are expected to stay in motion because motion is easier to steer. The moment you stop moving, people begin to notice who's been pushing. This dinner was not a celebration. It was not even a negotiation. It was a reminder. A reminder of who greenlights, who delays, who quietly labels someone difficult in a tone that sounds like concern. A reminder that favors circulate upward and consequences drift downward. He had been invited warmly, insistently, to hear about an upcoming slate, to be kept in mind, to smooth over recent tension with a producer whose name never appeared on screen but whose influence could stall a project without ever saying no. All he had to do was show up. Smile. Listen. Nod. Agree to talk later. That's how it usually works. But earlier that evening, standing in this same room, jacket still on, he had felt something unfamiliar, not anger, not pride, but clarity, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself. A realization that every yes he had given recently came with an invisible footnote, that his presence had become assumed, that his availability had been mistaken for permission. The phone rings again at 11:52. This time he reaches for it. Not to answer. To lift it from the cradle and set it face down on the table. That small movement, almost nothing, marks the beginning of a shift no one will fully understand until weeks later. At the dinner, someone finally signals for the server to clear the empty setting. A studio executive makes a joke that doesn't quite land. An agent, suddenly alert, stops checking his watch and starts calculating, not schedules, risk. Because in Hollywood, absence is never neutral. When a star explodes publicly, the industry closes ranks, damage control begins immediately, narratives are assigned, consequences are contained. But silence. Silence forces imagination to do the work. By the next morning, assistants will be making calls that go unanswered, meetings will be rescheduled, a project announcement will be delayed without explanation. No one will say his name directly, but it will hover in rooms like humidity. Did he walk away? Is he done playing along? Or worse, does he think he doesn't need us anymore? By choosing not to attend, not to explain, not to soften the moment, he has done something far more destabilizing than protest. He has introduced uncertainty. And Hollywood hates uncertainty in the people it thinks it owns. At 12:06 a.m., he finally removes his jacket and places it carefully over the back of a chair. He pours out the untouched drink without tasting it. Tomorrow, the industry will wake up exactly the same. But the balance beneath it will already be shifting. Because tonight wasn't about walking away from a dinner. It was about testing what would happen if he stopped proving his value to people who had grown comfortable managing it. And no one, especially him, yet understands how expensive that silence is about to become. October 18, 1958, 8 to 12 a.m. Los Angeles wakes up the way it always does, sunlight spilling over hills, studio gates opening on schedule, secretaries unlocking drawers that hold more leverage than some contracts. But something is already off. At one studio office, a junior assistant pauses with a phone receiver half raised. She hesitates, not because she forgot the number, but because she isn't sure it's still correct to call. On her desk is a handwritten note from the night before, just 2 words underlined once. Didn't come. No exclamation point, no explanation, just a fact that feels heavier than it should. Across town, an agent cancels his breakfast meeting. Not officially, just runs late. He needs time to think through what silence means when it comes from someone who has never been silent before. Hollywood runs on patterns. People rise, fall, burn out, or implode in ways the industry has learned to metabolize. But what happened last night doesn't fit any familiar category. There was no refusal on record. No argument. No demand. Just absence. And absence, when it's unexpected, reads like intent. By mid-morning, the story has already mutated, not through headlines but through tone. Conversations lower slightly when his name comes up. Questions are asked sideways. Everything all right with him? He didn't say anything, did he? You don't think he's pulling back? Pulling back. In Hollywood, that phrase carries a quiet threat. It suggests a person no longer racing to be included, someone willing to let opportunity come to them or pass entirely. For a system built on leverage through access, that's destabilizing. At 10:04 a.m., a producer who had expected to see him at the dinner yesterday sends a carefully worded message through an intermediary. Friendly, light, almost apologetic, though no apology is owed. No response. At 11:30, a studio publicist floats the idea of a casual lunch sometime soon. Not a meeting, just a check-in. Still nothing. This is the moment, the one no one notices in real time, when control begins to slip. Because power in Hollywood doesn't come from being loved, it comes from being necessary, and necessity depends on urgency. For years, this man's calendar has been full because everyone assumed it would be. His presence smoothed schedules, his name stabilized budgets, his willingness made plans feel safe. Now, without warning, that safety has vanished. And the psychological effect is immediate. When people don't know where you stand, they start adjusting where they stand. Studios hedge, agents soften their language, deals are reframed not as expectations but as invitations. The most telling change doesn't happen in any office. It happens internally. For the first time in a long while, he wakes up without an obligation waiting to ambush him. No script delivery, no rushed call, no voice reminding him what the next step should be. Just space. And with that space comes a dangerous question, dangerous not to him, but to everyone who has benefited from his momentum. What if I don't rush back? This wasn't a strike. It wasn't a protest. It wasn't even a plan. It was restraint. And restraint, in an industry addicted to constant visibility, reads as defiance. By early afternoon, a senior executive quietly instructs his assistant to leave it alone for now. That phrase, for now, is Hollywood's version of retreat. Because chasing someone who isn't running exposes who needs whom more. The absence has begun to work. Not because it's loud, but because it forces recalculation. People who once assumed they could summon him now have to consider the possibility that he might not come. And once that possibility exists, everything downstream changes: how roles are cast, how projects are paced, how negotiations are framed. He has not announced a pause, but the industry is already acting as if one has begun. And somewhere between unanswered calls and carefully postponed meetings, a new identity starts to take shape, not of a star who is difficult, but of one who is no longer easily positioned. By the end of the day, one truth has settled in quietly, uncomfortably across town. He didn't miss the dinner. He declined the rhythm. And Hollywood is only just beginning to understand what that costs. October 21st, 1958. 3 days later, and the industry is still pretending nothing has happened. That's how Hollywood absorbs shock, not by reacting but by delaying reaction long enough to see who blinks first. On paper, everything remains intact, projects still exist, contracts are still valid, his name still carries weight in memos and projections, but beneath the surface something subtle has begun to fracture. Because for the first time in years, people are hesitating before invoking him. A casting director pauses mid-sentence. A producer rewrites a pitch to sound less certain. An agent chooses a different phrase, if he's interested. That phrase alone would have been unthinkable a week ago. Hollywood doesn't mind powerful stars, it minds autonomous ones. Power can be managed, autonomy can't. For over a decade, his career had been shaped by a quiet agreement, unspoken but rigid. The studios provided momentum. He provided reliability. They kept him visible, productive, moving forward. In return, he didn't slow the machine. But slowing the machine, even unintentionally, reveals how much of it was built around you. On the fourth day, a studio accountant flags something minor, a scheduling overlap that would normally resolve itself because he would make it work. This time, no one is sure. The note travels upward, gaining weight as it goes. By noon, it reaches someone who understands what's actually at stake. If he doesn't bend his calendar, someone else will have to. If he doesn't absorb pressure, it moves elsewhere. And suddenly, his absence is no longer symbolic, it's logistical. That's when irritation enters the room. Not anger, not yet. Irritation is the early stage of lost control. Phone calls resume, but the tone has changed. No longer casual, no longer confident. There's a careful neutrality now, a softness that suggests the caller doesn't want to push too hard. Still no answer. And here's the part no one sees. This silence is not effortless for him. He feels it every morning when he walks past the phone, every afternoon when the hours stretch in ways they never used to. This is not indulgence, it's discipline. Because saying nothing is harder than explaining yourself. Explaining would invite negotiation. Negotiation would invite compromise. Compromise would restore the old rhythm. And the old rhythm is exactly what he has stepped out of. He begins to notice something unexpected. Without the constant pull of expectation, his thoughts slow, not in a lazy way but in a clarifying one. Ideas surface that had been buried under deadlines. Questions he hadn't allowed himself to ask now sit openly in his mind. What kind of roles actually matter to him? What kind of work would still feel honest 10 years from now? Who benefits when he stays busy and who does? This is where the psychological shift deepens. Hollywood trains its stars to equate movement with survival, to believe that stepping back is the same as disappearing, but what he's discovering is the opposite. The less he moves, the more others adjust. Offers begin to change shape. They arrive less frequently but with better terms, less assumption, more respect disguised as patience. A script lands that wouldn't have been sent before, not because it was beneath him but because it required someone who couldn't be rushed. That's new. And unsettling. Because now the industry is being forced to consider him not as a component in a schedule, but as a variable it can't predict. That unpredictability becomes its own form of leverage. By the end of the week, the dinner he skipped has already been reframed in memory, no longer an oversight, no longer a misunderstanding. Now it's being described quietly as a choice. And choice is dangerous. Choice suggests intent. Intent suggests independence. Independence suggests a shift in power. No one confronts him about it, that would require admitting concern. Instead, they wait. And in that waiting, something irreversible takes hold. Because once availability stops being assumed, it has to be earned. And Hollywood is realizing too late that it doesn't know how to earn him back without giving up something in return. November 2nd, 1958. 2 weeks in, and the silence has begun to acquire a price. Not for him, for everyone else. At a studio conference room downtown, a long table fills with familiar faces, contracts spread out like maps, coffee goes untouched. The conversation keeps circling the same point without landing. A picture is stalled. Not officially, it's in development. But everyone in the room knows the truth. The project was designed around him, his timing, his presence, his quiet ability to make other pieces fall into place. Without him, nothing quite aligns. Someone suggests waiting. Someone else suggests recasting. A third person doesn't speak at all, because recasting would raise questions no one wants to answer. Why didn't he do it? Why didn't he even say no? That unasked question is now costing money. And that's when Hollywood begins to feel fear, not emotional fear, but institutional fear. The kind that comes when systems discover a dependency they didn't realize they had. Meanwhile, across town, his days have taken on an unfamiliar rhythm. He wakes earlier than he used to, walks longer, reads scripts slowly instead of scanning for obligations. This isn't rest. It's recalibration. For the first time since his rise, his sense of self is no longer synchronized to the industry's tempo. He's no longer reacting, he's observing. And observation changes everything. He notices how often his previous choices were framed as opportunities when in reality they were maintenance. How often important meetings were simply exercises in reassurance for studios, for agents, for people who needed him visible to feel secure. Stepping out of frame has revealed how much of his career had been spent reinforcing other people's confidence rather than his own direction. That realization is both freeing and unsettling. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Back at the studios, the narrative continues to evolve. No one accuses him of arrogance. That would give him too much credit. Instead, concern is expressed. He might be tired. He's probably rethinking things. He'll come back around. These phrases serve a purpose. They frame his absence as temporary, explainable, controllable. But beneath them is a growing recognition that something has changed in how he is positioned. He is no longer someone to be managed forward. He is someone to be waited for. And waiting introduces vulnerability. A younger actor is mentioned as a possible alternative. The name is floated cautiously, then dismissed. Not ready, not stable enough, not him. The room goes quiet. That silence is expensive. Agents begin to feel the shift next. For years, his representation had been able to negotiate from a place of assumed urgency. Studios wanted him now before someone else got him. Now the urgency is inverted. Now studios want to know if they'll get him at all. And that subtle inversion changes the language of every deal. Fewer ultimatums. More options. Longer timelines. All because one man chose not to explain himself. Psychologically, this is the most dangerous phase, not because of backlash but because of temptation. The calls that do come now are different, more respectful, more flattering, more aligned with what he actually wants. The industry is adjusting its posture. An adjustment creates opportunity. But it also tests resolve. Because re-entering now too soon, too easily would confirm that the silence was a phase, not a stance, that it could be waited out. He understands this instinctively. So he holds. Even as uncertainty whispers. Even as doubt creeps in during quiet afternoons. Because restraint requires faith in your value, in your timing, in the belief that your absence is not a void, but a signal. By late November, a studio executive finally says what no one has wanted to articulate. We can't plan around him anymore. The sentence lands heavier than intended. Because planning around someone is another way of saying you assume their compliance. And that assumption is gone. In its place is something far more unsettling, respect edged with caution. The kind reserved not for stars who burn brightly, but for figures who reshape gravity. And the industry is only halfway through understanding that this wasn't a pause born of exhaustion. It was a test, when he is quietly passing. But the real reckoning, the moment when silence transforms into undeniable authority, is still ahead. Because eventually, Hollywood will have to decide whether to meet him where he stands or watch the old structure collapse around the space he left behind. December 14, 1958. Nearly 2 months since the dinner. By now, the absence has stopped feeling temporary. Hollywood has a remarkable ability to tolerate discomfort so long as it believes relief is coming. What unsettles the system isn't delay but ambiguity, and ambiguity has settled in like fog. In a corner office overlooking the lot, a senior executive studies a slate board that suddenly looks less solid than it did in October. Two projects are technically alive, neither is moving. Both were built with the same unspoken assumption: he'll be there. That assumption has expired. What replaces it is calculation. If they move forward without him, they risk admitting he mattered more than they claimed. If they wait, they concede something worse: that they don't control the timetable. This is the moment when silence turns into leverage. Not because he demands anything. Not because he threatens. But because his non-participation forces others to reveal their limits. Meanwhile, his own internal landscape has shifted again. The initial tension, the discipline of not responding, has softened into something steadier. Confidence, but quieter than confidence usually is, not bravado, not defiance. Alignment. He no longer feels the urge to justify the pause, even to himself. The fear that he might be forgotten has receded, replaced by a more grounded understanding. Visibility without agency is not security. And the industry is confirming this lesson for him, unintentionally. The offers that now arrive are not routine, they are specific, carefully framed, slower, more deferential in tone. One proposal includes an unusual clause: extended development time, guaranteed. Another offers script approval that would have been unthinkable a year earlier, not because he asked for it, but because they're trying to entice him back without pushing. That's the tell. When power is intact, it pressures. When power is uncertain, it persuades. The psychological shift on the other side of the table is profound. Executives who once spoke in schedules now speak in possibilities. Agents who once promised momentum now promise space. And space is what he has discovered he needs most. Still, he waits. Not out of strategy now, but out of principle. Because returning too soon would convert leverage into a concession. It would signal that the system still dictates the rhythm. And what he has learned, slowly and irrevocably, is that rhythm is everything. In late December, a studio head makes an uncharacteristically personal call. No intermediaries, no agenda disguised as courtesy. Just a voice acknowledging the pause without nomming it. "We'd love to know what you're thinking," the voice says. "Not what you'll do. Not when you're back. What you're thinking." That sentence would have been impossible 2 months earlier. He listens. And for the first time, he speaks, not much, not dramatically, but clearly. He doesn't explain the night he missed the dinner. He doesn't recount grievances. He doesn't outline demands. He simply states what kind of work he's willing to do now. And just as importantly, what kind he is. There's a pause on the other end of the line. Then acceptance. Not enthusiasm, not celebration. Acceptance. That's when it becomes undeniable: the power has shifted. Not because he left Hollywood, but because he proved he could stand still inside it. By the time the call ends, nothing has been signed, no announcements have been planned, no return date has been set. But something fundamental has been renegotiated, without contracts, without press, without confrontation. From this point forward, he will not be scheduled around. He will be consulted. And that distinction, subtle to outsiders, seismic inside the industry, marks the moment when silence stops being absence and becomes authority. What happens next will not look dramatic from the outside, but it will permanently alter how his career, and others like his, are shaped. Because once Hollywood learns that stepping back doesn't mean losing relevance, it can never fully unlearn it. February 6, 1959. Just after noon. The announcement is brief, almost understated. No fanfare, no quotes about exciting new chapters, no promises of a busy year ahead. A single project, carefully chosen, limited commitment, creative control implied more than stated. Industry trades note it, then move on. But inside Hollywood, the reaction is anything but casual. Because this isn't a comeback. Comebacks imply collapse. They suggest recovery from failure or absence caused by weakness. This is something else entirely. This is a reentry on new terms. The project itself is telling, not the kind of role designed to dominate marquees, but one that signals discernment. A part that requires patience from everyone involved. A production timeline that bends instead of presses. Studios read between the lines immediately. This is not a man returning to be used. This is a man choosing where to stand. Behind the scenes, the shift is felt most acutely by those who once controlled access. Agents adjust expectations, producers soften pitches, scripts are sent with cover notes that emphasize fit instead of opportunity. That language change matters. Because language reveals hierarchy. Before the pause, he was someone to be kept busy. After it, he becomes someone to be aligned with. Psychologically, the transformation is complete. He no longer feels compelled to justify quiet stretches between projects. He doesn't rush to fill space. The anxiety that once accompanied downtime has been replaced by something sturdier, a sense that time itself is now part of his leverage. And Hollywood responds accordingly. Fewer offers, better ones. Less noise, more weight. The industry begins subtly to treat him as a reference point rather than a resource. Younger actors are compared to him not just in talent but in trajectory. He's careful, someone says. He knows when to step back, another adds. These comments would have been framed as warnings once. Now they sound like respect. The most telling moment doesn't come from a deal or a review. It comes months later when another star, newer, hotter, under far more pressure, quietly delays a project without explanation. The move is noticed, discussed, handled differently than it would have been before. Because a precedent has been set. Not publicly, not officially, but psychologically. Hollywood has learned that constant visibility is not the only path to relevance. That withholding participation can, under the right conditions, consolidate power rather than dissolve it. And that lesson traces back to one unremarkable evening when a chair remained empty and no explanation followed. The man at the center of it never frames it as a strategy. In private, he describes it as listening to something he had ignored for too long, a sense that the industry's pace had become incompatible with his own. But whatever language he uses, the outcome is undeniable. From that point on, he is no longer rushed. No longer managed forward. No longer assumed. He has become something rarer than a star in Hollywood. He has become optional and therefore powerful. The pause didn't slow his career. It recalibrated it. And long after the details of that missed dinner fade from memory, its effect remains embedded in the industry's behavior. Quiet, structural, irreversible. Because in a system built on constant motion, the person who learns how to stop teaches everyone else how little control they ever truly had.